well, some regions seem to have been through more transitions than the others, and Mid-Volga is one of them, or seems to be one of them. It's where it is located. There's Upper Volga, which is a forest region. There's a Lower Volga, which is grasslands, and Mid-Volga is right in the between.
It doesn't have to be quite that close. It's okay.
Is it good now? Is it too quiet now? Okay, I'm always too quiet, so just let me know if something is wrong. So Mid-Volga is right in the middle, and it reacts on all possible, being marginal to both forests and the grasslands. It reacts to all kinds of changes, climatic changes, changes in the land use, in the intensity of land use, and so on. And our region of study is located in the northern part of the Mid-Volga region, and it's near Bulgar. It's quite a famous place because it was a capital or a center or a focus of the state of Volga Bulgaria in 10th to 13th century, and then it was very central to the Golden Horde Empire later on when the Volga Bulgaria was conquered. Just to show you how pretty it is now, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and what is quite important that the excavations, archaeological excavations, were going on for almost 100 years, so huge material has been accumulated. The modern landscape of the Volga area is agricultural, and you can see that the watersheds are flat, they're beautiful Chernozemic soils. You can see patches of sand moving along the plowed surface of farmlands. And there are some tiny hanging forests in places where the slope has been dissected, or by some reasons was not of agricultural use anymore. And the forests are mainly pine forests now. The area was more or less continuously occupied by people, but not always densely, and sometimes almost not populated. That's the chronological sequence of cultures in the area from the Bronze Age to the Middle Ages. So it gives the impression that there are no major hiatus or breaks in occupation from the early Iron Age on. But if we look at the distribution of the sites, then there is quite a dense occupation in the early Iron Age by the Ananina culture, and the sites are located close to the rivers. The two major rivers, Kama and Volga, and Volga is located right at the confluence. But then already by the 1st century BC, there's almost no population, so the sites are very sparse and none of them fits into our study area. Then people appear again in the 3rd to 5th century AD, and at first the early sites are again located along the rivers on low river terraces. But by the 7th century AD, watersheds are occupied as well, and you can see that all of a sudden, within about 200 years, the whole landscape has been exploited, occupied, utilized. And later on, the area was even more densely occupied by the Bulgars, and again, both the floodplains, river terraces, and also watersheds were included in the landscape used by people. And finally, in 13th century, when most of the areas in Mid-Volga were depopulated after the Golden Horde invasion, this area actually was populated. It was heavily used. There are many sites because it was a place that was prepared for the Golden Horde people to establish themselves. So it turns out that there was a hiatus of about 700 years between the Ananina, or early Iron Age culture, and the Imen'kovo, early Middle Ages cultures. So what does it mean? That we can look here at the whole array of changes that took place from the initial peopling of the landscape by the Imen'kovo cultures. This depopulated, pristinized, virginized landscape up to the formation of the empire of the Golden Horde in the same place a few centuries later. If you look at there are some observations, and I'm a soil scientist, so I'll just go shortly over that. When we look at the maps of surficial deposits, if we see sands, we suspect there should be forest, because sand can sustain, maintain forest vegetation even in the deserts. So why are there so many grasslands in the area that has a potential of being deforested? Definitely, we can suspect that these grasslands are anthropogenically of anthropogenic origin. Then, when we come to the modern forest steppe, there is such an incredible abundance of rodents, of soil-digging animals that are called fossorials. You cannot really step into the grassland soil without sinking into this material dumped on the surface. But when we look at the oldest sites of Imen'kovo or Volga time, they don't have any traces of this digging activities. So again, something major changed in the ecosystem. And also some small creatures, small but very important creatures, the earthworms. Actually, in old sites we don't find traces of the earthworms. And you think it's not important, it is, because they consume all the organics on the surface, and they do not allow fires to occur easily. And for slash and burn cultivation, for cleaning the pasture and so on, you have to ignite the surficial material somehow, surficial organics, but they don't allow it. So in the old soils we don't see them, but we see a lot of charcoal. So what we tried to study, and how we tried to study, we looked at the soils buried under the cultural layers, all kinds of embankments, and we've analyzed all the soils and deposits themselves, and trying to find evidence in situ for what happened in the landscape on the watershed. Because when for palynologists, what they do usually, they analyze peat deposits or lake deposits, and you cannot really extrapolate data that you gain from these wet places to the watershed. You cannot say really was there grassland or forest on the watershed, even if you look all kinds of all kinds of data in the wetland. You cannot say anything about the presence or absence of certain soil decomposers and so on. So anyway, so when we look at this dated paleo soils or buried soils, what we find is that at the early stages of the landscape transformation, it's definitely a forest landscape, no traces of anything related to the grasslands, no traces of the fossorials, spots, and a lot of charcoal in the layers. And this dark layer, it looks enormously dark, but it's because it's wet. When it dries up, it becomes lightish. It's typical for slash and burn cultivation. It contains charcoal of basswood, birch, and maple. So it's exactly the species that were cut, slashed, and burned in the cycle of the slash and burn cultivation. So this is what we find in charcoal. And then in Poland, we find pollen of birch and basswood. So what it means that the area becomes that was covered by this dark, continuous linden or basswood forest starts to open up, and there are places regrown by birch, which demands full light to grow. And finally, these layers contain such archaic crop as millet panicum. Just to show what it looks like, the phytoliths are tiny plant opal particles that are left in the soil after the slash and burn cultivation. What does it mean for the future generations? Once the landscape is scanned with the slash and burn cultivation, it's broken into parts that are on different stages of recuperation or recovering from the burning, and it's quite light. So if you look at the photos on the left, it's it's a birch forest, but it's darker than the right one. And what it means, there's not much grass on the ground. So the lighter is forest, the more useful it is for the pastures. So this stage is preparing for the creation of forest pastures. Next stage is abandonment of the area between the Imen'kovo and the Volga. And what happened there? We recorded numerous uprooting structures, and these are these large cat-like forms. And it means there was something abnormal, major windstorms in the area that coincided with the beginning of the medieval warming. If we look at the pollen and phytoliths and charcoal within these uprooting structures, they show a very interesting picture. So on the right, you see that initially there was linden forest, then when it was rotated, it was birch, and finally, after repeated fires and grazing, it turned into pine forest. After that, we have the pastures. We have deep soils rotated by the uprootings, and the soil is ready to be cultivated deeply. And the Volga Bulgarians, people of the Volga Bulgaria, start rotating soil with a very deep plow for over 20 centimeters deep. So very deep soils are formed, and at the early stages, again, they don't have any traces of rodents. It's just forest soil that's been plowed really deeply, and partially thanks to the preparation by this massive uprootings. But on the right, it's yes, and also this deep rotation allows the earthworms to appear there, and it's a no-return point for the Swedes. You cannot burn soil that is processed by the earthworms. On the right, there's a buried grassland soil from late Volga period, and you can see numerous traces of spots of the rodents there, which means that permanent pastures are created, and this area starts acting as a grassland. So the phytolith analysis showed also the movement from millet to wheat production in the soils. And the final stage of the transformation, the golden horde. And here we looked at the buried soils and at colluvial fan deposits. And what they showed us that the soils that were buried under the embankments were already Chernozemic. So just a couple of 100 years of cultivation in a warm climate, and the Chernozems are created. And it's a totally new stage for how agriculture can develop from this time on. The Chernozems don't require any much of the extra nutrients or fertilizers to maintain their fertility. Also, a huge erosional activity, accumulation of several meters of deposits in gullies associated with overgrazing. And pollen diagrams show that during the whole entire period of the Golden Horde, the area was largely treeless and the wheat was grown. So that is the overall diagram. I'm almost done. And there are clusters of vegetation associated with different periods. You can see how different they are. And actually, the landscape now is even a bit more forested than during the Golden Horde. It's closer to the Volga time, but you can see that.
I'm going to have to cut you off because there are 4 more people.
So that's what it looked like, presumably, coming to the modern anthropogenic landscape. Each previous stage prepared the stage for the next occupation and created certain conditions for the utilization of the landscape. Thank you.